Are calling on the federal government to take concrete steps to counter Islamophobia in Canada. The coalition of groups warns that Islamophobia is on the rise in this country and the federal government must act quickly to curb racist sentiment against Canada's 1 million Muslims. And they raised concerns that young Muslims who've been the targets of racism could pose a threat later.
Islamophobia impacts relationships with other students, as well as their grades in some cases. We are concerned that in the absence of appropriate supports, many youth will internalize this pain and subsequent resentment may surface in unhealthy ways. Those without adequate family, school, and community supports may act out in other negative behavior, while some may turn to the internet to find answers and become targets for violent extremist recruitment.
Well, joining me now is Ihsaan, the Executive Director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. Good to see you again. Thanks for coming in to speak with me.
Thank you for having me, Peter.
We heard from Aisha Shirazi at the news conference today that you were at, by the way, warning that Islamophobia may push some Muslim young people to resent Canada and perhaps act out in unhealthy ways, perhaps even becoming the targets for recruiters looking to recruit young people for violent extremism. Are you seeing some of that isolation among young Muslims because of the way they feel treated? What are you seeing?
Well, Peter, this idea of the dialogue that is taking place, the discourse that is happening, the anti-Muslim discourse that is happening certainly does have the potential to make young people and vulnerable people feel a sense of alienation and wanting to look for answers to the questions that they have. They may go online, they may go other places to try and find answers. And we know that the narrative that violent extremists push is a narrative of us versus them, of the idea that the West, the so-called West, is at war with Islam. And they use that, and they use that kind of a Islamophobic narrative that is in the public discourse to try and make their point, to say that no matter how hard you try, you will never be accepted. You will never be as Canadian as everybody else. You'll never be accepted for who you are and allowed to practice your religious faith in the way that other Canadians are. And so that sets them up for that kind of I guess, vulnerability to that kind of messaging. If they're hearing on the other side of the equation that, Islam is inferior, that Muslims, are inherently violent, and all of these myths and mythologies and stereotypes about Muslims that keep getting pumped out and propagated in the mainstream media. But we have to recognize as well that some of this discomfort with Islam and Muslims is a large part of it is due, in fact, to fear and ignorance, in my experience. The fear of Muslims and misunderstanding of Muslims. What I take great comfort in is that what we've seen in study after study is that the more interaction that people have with Muslims, the more positively they tend to view them.
Tell me what you're hearing in the public discourse. When you talk about the public discourse, the anti-Muslim public discourse, Islamophobia, what are you hearing? What can you point to?
Well, I mean, there's the obvious elephant in the room, so to speak, in the recent election of Mr. Trump, that has obviously galvanized and really mobilized a lot of the Islamophobic and racist discourse and the people who are propagating that as well. We've seen, key members of his team and advisors who are openly Islamophobic, and that's very worrying because, there's, what happens in the U.S. tends to also have an impact on us here in Canada.
And what's the impact you're seeing in Canada?
Well, what we've seen in Canada is, we've had this discourse even before Trump. When we had our federal election last year, we saw anti-Muslim rhetoric being used, and what our organization has noted is that every time that Muslims and Islam are in the media in a negative way, whether it's through events or incidents that occurred, or whether it's political leaders and elected officials using language that is inflammatory, that sort of vilifies a particular group, in this case Muslims, our organization has noted a trend that we see a spike in the number of incidents that is reported. So we have currently election or leadership races underway here as well in Canada. And some of that similar discourse around Canadian values and so forth is being felt.
And screening immigrants to Canada for their Canadian values.
For Canadian values. And that's a very vague thing. And we've spoken with Ms. Leach and told her that this is very, very concerning because, while nobody is saying that we should not have a robust and rigorous debate about how we best manage our diversity. The danger here, Peter, is that people could latch onto this as sort of a calling, a calling to actually vilify and to target what is different. And now what is most different and what is people are most unaware of is Islam and Muslims. So we urged Ms. Leach that, she made it clear that her call was not to target immigrants, not to target minorities or Muslims. So we urged her that, if that's the case, then make sure that you state that very publicly and very clearly, and that if people are taking it that way, who are, supporting you, that you don't want their support if that's how they're interpreting it.
What you wanted to say today was that you want the federal government to play a leadership role in fighting Islamophobia. Specifically doing what? What do you want the government to do?
Well, we're calling on the government to take a holistic, all-of-government approach. So not just looking at areas like public safety, but we have to understand that racist ideas and ideologies have their underpinnings in other issues in society as well, economic, social, and so forth. It has to be community-centric in its focus and founded really on an evidence-based approach. And when I say evidence-based approach, it's really three things. Looking at data collection and the contextualization of the data and the reporting that we're getting. As I mentioned, NCCM has been collecting data on anti-Muslim hate crimes now for a number of years. We have our online hate crimes and hate incidents awareness map, which your viewers can look at nccm.ca/map. But we also know that this data that we're collecting, we know that the challenge of underreporting as well. Statistics Canada itself says that up to 2/3 of hate crimes go underreported or unreported. So that's very deeply concerning as well. The data that we have from Statistics Canada is 2 years after the fact. So we're only now getting the 2014 data when we're in 2016, which is one of the reasons why we launched our map. A second part of the data piece of the puzzle is to do a leading practices review, to look at what are other jurisdictions doing through a number of different methodologies, doing interviews, doing document reviews, doing data and financial reviews of what are other jurisdictions doing and what is working. And then to also finally, the last piece of the data puzzle is to do a needs assessment, Peter, to look at the impacted communities. And I say communities because we're not just talking about just the Muslim community here. Other minority communities are also targeted for hatred as well. And looking at how do we maximize the very limited resources that government has at its disposal to have the maximum possible result, and then look at population and demographic data as well, so that when we're planning these strategies, Peter, we can actually look at a scalable solution moving forward into the future. But that's how we look at a strategy, and those are sort of the principles that we're asking the government to take when they're approaching that strategy.
Right.
In the interim, it's important that they speak out. When they hear Islamophobic or anti-Muslim sentiments, words matter, Peter. And it's important that they speak out and make it clear that this kind of hatred will find no quarter in Canada.
The Prime Minister's been saying, look, if you want to fight Islamophobia, get more, in this particular case, get more Muslims involved in the political process for whichever party at whichever level. But that's the way you can also make a difference, by being in a position to make decisions from a place of power and influencing the debate, the dialogue, the policies. What's your response to that proposal?
Well, I think it's part of the solution, certainly. Our organization, Peter, as you know, is strictly nonpartisan. We have supporters from across the political spectrum, and we encourage Muslims and Muslim communities from across the country to really be involved in all political parties. It's important to have a voice at the table so that your voice is heard before policies are introduced and before the train has already left the station. As the expression goes, Peter, if you're not at the table, chances are you're on the menu.
All right. Ihsaan, Gardee, always good to speak to you. Thanks for coming in today.
Thanks for having me in, Peter.